the Little Sisters of the Poor at the Supreme Court. Justices weigh the debate over religious freedom. A moment of silence for victims of terrorism, where the Brussels investigation stands tonight. Presidential primaries, which candidates gain momentum this week. And Holy Week at the Vatican. A full report from Alan Holdren in Rome. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Spy Wednesday, March 23rd, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. The battle over religious freedom takes center stage at the U.S. Supreme Court. The Little Sisters of the Poor and other faith groups join forces to fight the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. Jason Calvi begins our team coverage from the Supreme Court tonight. Jason?
Brian, I saw several Catholic leaders inside the courtroom today. The president of Catholic University of America, the Archbishop Cardinal of Washington, D.C., the man this case is named after, Pittsburgh Bishop David Zubik, as well as the Little Sisters of the Poor. All of these groups say the government is forcing them to violate their faith.
The Little Sisters of the Poor say they'd be complicit in sin if they followed the government's rule. The so-called accommodation would make them fill out an exemption form, which the sisters say triggers birth control coverage for their employees. The question for the court, does that create a substantial burden?
The burden is the burden on our conscience of having to collaborate with something that we consider to be morally objectionable and evil. The second burden is the $70 million in fines that across the country our homes would have to face every year.
Only one appeals court has agreed with the religious nonprofits. 8 appeals courts have sided with the government, saying the accommodation is not a substantial burden.
If Little Sisters objects, their plan does not cover the contraception. The government arranges for a separate plan through the insurer. It is a separate plan. It's separately paid for. It's separately administered.
And Justice Stephen Breyer says everyone faces some burdens to take part in society. But Chief Justice John Roberts says the accommodation hijacks the sisters' health plan. Swing vote Justice Anthony Kennedy agrees, saying it seems to be a substantial burden. The next question then becomes, does the government have a strong reason to impose that burden?
The government has already exempted plans covering tens of millions of Americans, in fact 100 million Americans, from this mandate. And so it's hard for the government to convince the Supreme Court that it must impose this mandate on the Little Sisters of the Poor when its own health care plans do not comply with this mandate.
The Obama administration says the rights of female employees would be extinguished. They would have to, in some instances, go to a second doctor to get contraception. The decision in this case is expected by the end of the Supreme Court term in June. Earlier in the day, though, people were out here praying and rallying for the Little Sisters of the Poor, and one of the people here was Catherine Szeltner. Catherine?
Jason, while the justices were divided, most of the activists outside the court were supporting the faith-based groups. As people told me over and over, it's hard to protest against a group of religious sisters who serve the elderly poor. Let them serve was the rallying cry on the Supreme Court steps today. Hundreds of people showed support for the Little Sisters of the Poor and the 6 other cases going up against the government. Support came from across the nation and the age spectrums.
Nice to be out here to support a good cause.
We want to stand up for rights and respect, and we believe that this is very important.
Really, it's a fight for religious liberty so we can practice our religion in the country and not just because we oppose a certain thing.
The rally was hosted by a group of women fighting the mandate.
Women want the world to know that the government's view of what it takes for essential health care is not sterilization, not abortion-inducing drugs, and not contraception.
We've been told that because we're women, we're supposed to side with the government on this issue, which is incredibly paternalistic and condescending. You look around and it's a sea of women, it's a sea of nuns.
One of those nuns was Little Sister of the Poor, Therese Marie, who served cookies to the crowds.
Thank you.
I'm praying very, very hard, and I have great confidence in God and great trust that He's going to support us through this and that we will succeed in His eyes and according to His will.
Support for the sisters went beyond these steps and onto social media in a digital rally. People tweeted encouragement with the hashtag #LetThemServe. There were activists here siding with the government, but there wasn't the pushing and shoving that's often seen outside other divisive Supreme Court hearings. Brian.
Thank you, Catherine and Jason at the U.S. Supreme Court. Carrie Severino, Chief Counsel and Policy Director for the Judicial Crisis Network, joins us. You were in the courtroom. What could you tell from the questions the justices asked about what might happen?
Well, with the caveat that you never really know, I feel coming out, I feel like we had a strong 4 votes in favor of religious freedom when you have Justice Kennedy, who's expected to be the swing vote on this, saying things like the sisters' plans are being hijacked by the government and that there's clearly a burden here. I think that that makes me feel very confident. There's even the potential that we could get someone like Justice Breyer maybe signing on as well.
So 4 votes would mean a tie. So Justice Scalia's absence is really critical here.
Yeah, you could really feel his absence, both because he was such an avid questioner, and they finally have taken his seat out of the courtroom. There were only 8 chairs. We know that if there's a 4-4 split, there's a couple options. They could affirm the decisions below, and then since most of those are actually at a preliminary stage of the case, it really would just delay the case. It probably would come back up again, maybe once we have that 9th vote. They may also just choose to hold the case, and I think that's very possible because it's so important.
Did Justice Thomas ask any questions?
Not today.
Not
today.
Quiet.
Yep.
So what happens if the court rules against the Little Sisters?
Well, if they actually had 5, I would be surprised if they got a decisive ruling, 5 votes against Little Sisters. That could mean crushing fines. It could force many of these religious institutions, Little Sisters and others, to close their doors. That would be a real tragedy. But I think, in my opinion, the worst we would get is a 4-4 split. And again, that probably would really not be a defeat so much as a delay to the case. I think it reminds us, though, how crucial this 9th seat on the court is. The next Supreme Court justice will probably be the deciding vote in this case. And we know that Judge Garland, who's been nominated, actually had a vote against the Priests for Life on this exact issue. So if he were confirmed to the court, I think that would bode very, very poorly for their long-term success. So we need to hope that we can still get a justice who will stand up for religious freedom.
Thank God he probably will not get a hearing.
I don't think so.
From the Judicial Crisis Network, Carrie Severino, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. We're following a developing story. Investigators say the suspected bomb maker in November's Paris attacks is one of the suicide bombers who died at the Brussels airport. Meanwhile, the chairman of the U.S. House Intelligence Committee believes the terrorists were actually targeting Americans yesterday. Representative Devin Nunes says an explosion at the Brussels airport was near the counters for 3 U.S.-based airlines. He says the subway blast was near the U.S. Embassy. Secretary of State John Kerry plans to meet with government leaders in Brussels on Friday. Regular passengers will not be allowed back to the airport until at least Saturday. Belgian prosecutors identify 2 of the Brussels attackers as brothers. They say Khalid El-Bakraoui targeted the subway. Ibrahim El-Bakraoui was a suicide bomber at the airport. A note on computer shows that the airport bomber felt increasingly unsafe and feared landing in prison. Turkish officials say he was deported from Turkey in June. Belgium's justice minister says he was a known criminal, but not considered a terrorist. The people of Belgium remember the victims of the attacks with a moment of silence today. Thousands gathering in the public square in solidarity for the victims and their families. Belgium is holding 3 days of mourning for those killed in Tuesday's bombing. The State Department issues a travel alert for U.S. citizens traveling to and throughout Europe for the next 90 days. The department says terrorist groups continue to plan near-term attacks throughout Europe. They're targeting sporting events, tourist sites, restaurants, and transportation. Now, you shouldn't cancel your trip, but you should remain vigilant and report anything suspicious. Vice President Joe Biden and his wife Jill offer condolences to the people of Belgium. Today, they visited the Belgian embassy in Washington. Wyatt Goolsby reports from there tonight.
Brian, the Bidens came to write a note in a book of condolences here at Belgium's embassy. They also greeted the Belgian ambassador, the vice president saying, "I wish we didn't have to be here." But he also says he's confident that the Belgian people will remain strong.
They're mobilizing all the elements of their community as well as their capability to begin to crack down on and eventually eliminate these terror cells. They will prevail.
Vice President Biden says the U.S. is prepared to offer Belgium whatever they need that could help Brussels in their investigation and recovery. While the Belgian people mourn, witnesses to Tuesday's attacks say they're not going to let terrorists scare them.
I don't want to let this take me down, and I want to stay positive and not start to live in fear.
You know, the thing with the terrorism and everything else, it's like I said before, it could happen anytime and anywhere, and you just have to be aware, and that's all you can do.
The attacks have even made their way into the presidential campaign. Where the candidates differ is how to respond to the threat by ISIS.
We need to have significantly improved intelligence.
But we have to toughen our surveillance, our interception of communication.
I would make every effort I could to strengthen the NATO alliance.
Others, like Ted Cruz, say police should be able to patrol Muslim neighborhoods to prevent radicalization. Donald Trump renewed his proposal to temporarily ban Muslims from entering the country. Earlier today, the House of Representatives approved a resolution that declares ISIS a threat to freedom. President Obama has also vowed to go after the terrorist group, saying their defeat is his top priority. Brian?
Thank you, Wyatt Goolsby. And Pope Francis today calls for unanimous condemnation of the Brussels terror attacks. Alan Holdren, Rome Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency, joining us from the Eternal City. Alan, the Holy Father used strong words at today's general audience. What did he say?
Well, he spoke out against these terrorist attacks in Belgium, calling them cruel abominations. He called for the terrorists to convert and for people to pray for the victims. He actually led a silent prayer at the audience in which everybody partook. The security outside St. Peter's Square was very tight today after these attacks in Belgium, and we do expect a lot of people to be here in Rome during this Holy Week. Just last year, 100,000 people were here for the Easter Mass on Sunday.
Also, the Holy Father will wash the feet of 12 refugees for Holy Thursday's foot washing rite. Remind us of the changes in norms for that rite and the rest of the Holy Father's Triduum schedule.
Well, in January, we learned about these changes that you spoke of. Women will also be included in the foot washing ceremonies in the world, including together with men, as has long been the tradition. In many parts of the world, women already did take part in these ceremonies. There at the refugee camp, the Pope will be washing the feet of men and women both, and also Catholics, Coptic Christians, Muslims, and also one Hindu this year, so we can expect to hear about that. The greater celebrations that they start on Holy Thursday and go through Good Friday with regular Stations of the Cross. This year they're focused on mercy, this being the Jubilee of Mercy. Also on Saturday we have the Easter Vigil in which adults will be baptized, and on Sunday Easter Mass and the Urbi et Orbi blessing with the Pope there on the balcony of St. Peter's just behind me.
Thank you for that look at the Triduum in Rome. Alan Holdren, we appreciate you.
Thanks so much, Brian.
Turning to politics now, Tuesday's Western primaries end with mixed results. Republican Donald Trump won Arizona as Ted Cruz takes Utah. Hillary Clinton won among Arizona Democrats, while Bernie Sanders wins Idaho and Utah. The one name you don't see is John Kasich. The Ohio governor has only been able to win his home state. Ted Cruz says that disqualifies him from being on the ballot at the Republican National Convention. The rules say you have to win at least 8 states.
The only thing Kasich can do is what he's doing now, which is play the role of a spoiler and help Donald Trump.
Cruz picks up an endorsement from former presidential candidate Jeb Bush. He calls Cruz a principled conservative. Bush urges voters to reject Donald Trump, warning Republicans will lose the general election if they don't. House Speaker Paul Ryan calls this year's political campaigns discouraging. He says they add to the distrust of government.
Sometimes today we see a politics that is degrading, a politics that's going to the basis of our emotions, of what disunifies us, not what unifies us.
Ryan spoke this morning here in Washington. He thinks political leaders should talk about ideas that bring people together rather than prey on people's separations or their identities. Coming up, a critical look at Cuba. A dissident shares his inside view of the communist government. And continuing coverage of today's Supreme Court case, how it could define religious freedom in America. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday of Holy Week, known as Spy Wednesday. I'm Brian Patrick, and President Obama is in Argentina tonight, hoping to strengthen ties between the South American country and the United States. The president met with Argentina's newly elected president, Mauricio Macri, in Buenos Aires today. Security was very tight in the wake of the terror attacks in Brussels. The two met at the presidential palace discussing trade, energy, technology, education, and the environment. Tonight, 400 guests are invited for a formal state dinner with the two presidents. President Obama ended his historic trip to Cuba yesterday. Before leaving, he met with dissidents on the island who want more freedom. Last September, our Susie Pinto sat down in Havana with a political prisoner who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2008. He is still fighting today for democracy in Cuba.
Dr. Oscar Biscet knows Cuba's struggles well. The pro-life and human rights activist has been fighting Cuba's communist regime for more than 30 years. The devout Christian says there's no religious freedom in Cuba, and those who express dissent are harassed by the government. After more than 50 years of dictatorship, Biscet is calling for free elections in Cuba. He compares Raul Castro to Hitler or Stalin. And the doctor says while Castro is in power, there will be no freedom. But after decades of conflict with the government, including jail and torture, Biscet has not lost sight of his goal. His dream, a free Cuba. Susie Pinto, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Susie. A story you will only see on EWTN News Nightly. Returning to our top story now. 8 Supreme Court justices are considering arguments heard today from challengers of the Obama administration's contraceptive mandate. We have representatives of 2 of the petitioners fighting the mandate. Dr. Michael McLean is president of Thomas Aquinas College in Southern California. Stephanie Barclay, legal counsel at the Becket Fund. Becket represents the Little Sisters and EWTN in our case that's pending in an appeals court. Stephanie, what do you see as the solution to this dilemma?
Well, there's actually a really easy, common sense solution here that would both protect the religious rights of the Little Sisters of the Poor and allow the government to accomplish its stated goal. And that is to use its own insurance exchanges to provide these services and to use the insurance exchanges in the way that they were meant to do with other things like dental plans and other options so that they can leave the Little Sisters out of it. In fact, today during oral argument, multiple Supreme Court justices asked about these exchanges and pointed out that the government uses these exchanges and other government programs for the over 100 million Americans who are exempt from the HHS mandate. Why can't they do the same for the Little Sisters to protect their beliefs? And the government had no good answer to that question.
And Thomas Aquinas College, one of the challengers today, how does this mandate infringe upon what your university is all about?
Well, Brian, Thomas Aquinas College is very proud of its fidelity to the church and its loyalty to Christ and the teachings of the church. And those are central parts of our mission as a Catholic educational institution. The mandate, unfortunately, would require us to cooperate in the provision of coverages for practices and medications and things which are really contrary to Catholic moral teaching. And as a Catholic educational institution, we simply refuse to do that. We feel it's important for us to model to our students, to our benefactors, to our alumni, and to all of our supporters our loyalty to the church and our belief and practice of Catholic moral teaching.
Yeah, your Catholic identity is truly who you are. This violates that. So what about this accommodation? That's not enough.
Well, when the government tried to make that argument today in oral argument, many of the justices were not convinced that the government has really offered any real accommodation at all. It's more of a fiction. And the government itself admitted that what it is doing is trying to get the Little Sisters of the Poor to change their health plan to offer these services that violate their religious beliefs. That's not an accommodation. And what the Supreme Court justices point out today is that a real accommodation would be to use the government's own exchanges to provide these services directly so that they can leave the Little Sisters out of it, let them continue their good work of caring for the elderly poor as they have been doing for over 175 years.
Dr. McLean, are you confident of victory here, and what would happen if they rule against you?
Well, I think I'm reasonably confident of victory. I thought the attorneys on our side did a wonderful job today presenting our case and responding to the questions that the justices posed. I think in the event that we would get a 4-4 tie, then there's a chance that the case would be referred for re-argumentation next year after at least a ninth justice is appointed. In the meantime, we would be, I think, free from having to abide by the mandate. And if in the worst case scenario we were to lose, we would have to look at all of our options and see if there's a way in which we can continue to provide coverage for our employees, but in a way which is consistent with our faith.
Dr. Michael McLean, Stephanie Barclay, thanks for being with us, both of you.
Thank you, Brian.
Up next, Good Friday Stations of the Cross in remembrance of abortion victims. And Holy Week represented in art. See the beauty of faith. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick for EWTN News Nightly, and the Pope's new ambassador to South Africa gives his first interview in 15 years. Archbishop Peter Wells spoke with EWTN News Nightly's Mary Shovlin. He's amazed at what Pope Francis has accomplished in just 3 years as leader of the Church.
He has a keen sense of what is happening, but he never, ever loses the idea that it is the human person who is at the center.
Watch more of Mary's interview on Easter Monday right here on EWTN News Nightly. This Good Friday, pro-life Christians have a unique way to mark the Lord's Passion. A Way of the Cross for victims of abortion will be held outside dozens of abortion facilities across the country. The Pro-Life Action League's Eric Scheidler says there's a clear tie between the stations and abortion.
We saw a real connection between the suffering and death of Jesus on the cross, his passion, and the killing of these children. Innocent life being taken, really being sacrificed. Golgotha, where our Lord was crucified, the place of the skull. The local abortion facility is the Golgotha in each of our communities.
The Pro-Life Action League's website has details on how you can participate in A Way of the Cross for victims of abortion. Dr. Jem Sullivan, author of The Beauty of Faith, joining us to look at works of art that coincide with Holy Week. Our first piece is 3 panels, before, during, and after the crucifixion.
We know that Holy Week is the high point of the Church's liturgical year, and this beautiful triptych from the National Gallery invites us to contemplate the sacred events of Holy Week in visual form. On the left panel, we see the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is deep in prayer as he prepares to undergo his passion. In the distance, we see soldiers approaching to arrest him. As he leaves the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus finds the disciples. They're asleep instead of keeping watch with him. The central panel is the hour of our Lord's crucifixion. This is when Jesus nailed to the cross in agony with the 2 thieves beside him. Mary, his mother, falls to the ground in anguish, overcome with grief. And the disciples, John and Mary Magdalene, are at the foot of the cross. On the right panel is the scene of Jesus descending into limbo. This is Holy Saturday, as it were. Jesus reaching out to all those lost souls who need to be reconciled to God. And John the Baptist holding up a scroll on which is written, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world."
We also have a 16th century oil painting, very intense image of the crucifixion.
That's right. There's some 20 paintings of the German artist Matthias Grunewald that have survived, and this is one of them from the National Gallery of Art. This is arguably one of the most powerful images of the crucifixion ever painted, because we see the full horror of the crucifixion, Jesus' physical suffering, his agony, as it were, on the cross. The artist shows us Jesus' bruised and emaciated body. The weight of his body bends the cross beam downwards. His clothes are tattered. His head bleeds from the crown of thorns pierced into his forehead. Our eyes, though, are drawn to Jesus' hands and fingers nailed to the cross, yet straining upward towards heaven in anguish. At the foot of the cross are Mary, his mother, the kneeling Mary Magdalene, and John, the disciple. Grunewald is reminding us that the price of our redemption was nothing less than the blood that Jesus shed for our salvation. This is divine, incarnate, crucified love that is God's great gift to us this Holy Week.
Thank you for taking us deep into the Holy Week story. The Beauty of Faith is Dr. Jem Sullivan's book. Thank you, Jem.
Thank you.
That discussion recorded earlier this week. And for our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. You'll see special Holy Thursday and Good Friday programming the next few nights here on EWTN. We wish you and yours a blessed Triduum as we leave you tonight praying for the victims of the Brussels bombings and their families.